Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sam Bloch. I'm a staff writer at The New Food Economy, which is an online magazine in New York City. I've been covering this field of cell-cultured meat, formerly clean meat, maybe cell-based meat, for, I guess, 6-8 months now. And I'm really excited to be joined by these four, I guess you could call them stakeholders, and I think of it that way because they're all representing a different part of what this is all about and how this technology can, as the title says, really impact the industry. So beginning on the left, I'd like to introduce Joe Morris of Morris Grassfed. He's a San Juan Bautista-based cattle rancher where he raises grass-fed beef on certified organic rangeland. Next to him is Brian Spears, the co-founder and CEO of New Age Meats, which is a San Francisco company that makes pork from animal cells. Next to him is Mark Dopp, the general counsel for the North American Meat Institute, which is the largest trade association for the meat industry. And over here is Brian Sylvester, who is special counsel at Wiley, Rein. It's a regulatory law firm that specializes in federal policy, and he is himself a former attorney with the US Department of Agriculture. So I just want to get started today, and kind of by way of introducing the panelists here, I want them to explain what it is that they're trying to accomplish with their work. And I know that kind of sounds like an anodyne, boring question, but I really want to hear about their values. When it comes to meat, what kind of future do you guys want to see? Maybe we could start with Brian.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Great question. So my core values that guide me in my practice of law are excellence, integrity, and creativity. As a lawyer, I need to be a trusted advisor to companies. And how do you develop trust other than producing excellent work product? And is an excellent work product really creative solutions to complex issues? And so I just fell into learning about cell culture technology earlier this year when I was presenting at a conference. I had the good fortune of meeting Eric Schulze from Memphis Meats and folks from the Good Food Institute. Kept the conversation going, giving my perspective, leveraging my experience at the USDA. Wrote an article for Food Safety News on possible regulatory pathways that we'll get into later on. But as a lawyer, I'm just excited to really apply my knowledge of the law to help companies get innovative products into the marketplace to help feed the world. So I'm really excited about being part of the conversation.
Well, first, thanks for the invitation. Appreciate the opportunity. Since I'm speaking on behalf of the Meat Institute, let me say that our priorities 1 through 5 are to ensure that the meat products that come out of federally inspected plants are safe. In terms of core values, I don't know. I guess we sort of work from the motto of educate, advocate, and influence. Education can be of the media. It could be of our member companies, it could be of the government, it could be of a lot of people, and advocating on behalf of the membership in favor of a regulatory system that works, and then hopefully we have some influence. So that pretty much sums it up. If you've got that, I'll send it back.
Yeah. So we are, myself and our company is very social impact driven. So we sum it up in 3 ways, or in 3 areas: the environment, human health, animal welfare. So the University of Oxford, there's a report recently on environmental effects, for instance, of eating meat. And their conclusion was there is no greater action that a consumer can take than to stop eating meat. And I should say stop eating traditional meat because of all of the environmental effects. It's not just the greenhouse gases. It is also the deforestation, the species extinction, the land and water use. That would be on the environmental side. There's also the human health side. So 80% of the antibiotics that we use we use to keep ourselves healthy are fed to animals that are not healthy, and that creates antibiotic-resistant infections. 23,000 Americans die every year from antibiotic-resistant infections, so that's a problem. And then on the animal welfare side, so 121 million pigs, so we do pigs, 121 million pigs each year are slaughtered in the US. So as demand for cheap meat increases, that means that animals are forced onto smaller and smaller confined areas and in poor conditions. And so we're trying to stop that.
So I am really happy to be here. I'm probably perceived as a bit of an oddball, but I'm not. I'm very much like like you guys, older than 99% of you, but very much the same. I have a deep set of values, and I try to put them to work in my life every day. You all seem to see big problems on the horizon, and you are passionately trying to address them, and I think that's really wonderful. I was at the beach this morning, Ocean Beach, and it was really a spectacular morning. I was drinking a cup of coffee, and I was walking out towards the ocean, looking at the ocean. It was just massive and beautiful. And then I turned around, and I saw the sunrise, which was overwhelming. And I say this not to illustrate the point that I was at the beach, but because there are many perspectives. And if we don't get many perspectives on important issues, we miss things like the rosy-fingered dawn. So my family has been at work caring for land and livestock in California for 5 generations. My wife and I, Julie, have been running Morris Grass-Fed Beef for about 30 years. And what we intend to do is to create circumstances whereby people can be peaceful, our customers can be well-nourished, our land can be increasing in ecological function, carbon can move from the atmosphere into the soils and remain there. And as it is there in increasing amounts, it can hold water. And we do this by managing the grazing of our animals. And our animals are absolutely integral to how the earth cools itself. And finally, we want to conduct a business that is sustainable economically with socially just actions in our community.
Great. Thanks, guys. So maybe we can, Joe, if you want to keep going, I want to turn to you and then also to Mark, because I want to ask you, and I think we already got a bit of taste of this, but pun intended, how do traditional meat companies view this technology? You know, Mark over here with the Meat Institute, his members, Tyson and Cargill, correct me if I'm wrong, are investing in this technology. Maybe they see it as competition, maybe they see it as an opportunity. Joe, you might have a different take on it. So one of the two, you guys tell me what traditional meat has to say about this tech.
Oh, am I going first? Either one. Okay, you want to go first?
Oh, go ahead.
All right. Well, you're right. Excuse me. Tyson and Cargill have invested in this technology, as has, I believe, Maple Leaf Foods, which is a member of ours up in Canada. What I can tell you is that on behalf of the Meat Institute, I think the companies probably view it more as not so much as competition, but as an opportunity. If you look at the letter that we signed with Memphis Meats to the president back in August, that letter said that we view this as an and, not an or, position. And that pretty much represents the position of the Meat Institute. We think that there is room for both. Now, there are a lot of questions that have to be answered, and we're going to talk about some of those issues in terms of who regulates, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, if we're going to feed, 9 billion people in the next 50 years or whatever the growth is, it's going to have to come from somewhere. So let's find a way to get this done in a way that makes sense and is fair for everyone.
So I do not intend to cause offense to anybody, but my peers, if they think about it at all, they think about it as, and here's a name for you, fake meat. Probably wouldn't market well, so don't go that way. But that's what they consider it. As for me, I hadn't really thought a lot about it, but I listened pretty carefully to the speakers this morning and the various panels and the VCs and everybody, and you guys are really enthusiastic. And the problem with enthusiasm, and I don't see a lot of diversity in the room, the problem with enthusiasm, especially when supplied with copious amounts of money, sounds like, and energy, is that I'm not sure you're asking the question is, what don't we know that we need to know in order to make sure we don't make problems worse? Frankly, it's pretty ironic, but it's true that the new ways of conforming, bringing meat to the market, in your sense of meat, aren't that much different to me than traditional ways. And you're talking about disruption, and I asked the question, are you disrupting what you think you're disrupting? I mean, one of the reasons that Cargill sees this as an opportunity is because they don't have to change very much. Right now, they supply animals and feedlots with energy. What I understand you're doing is you're going to have bioreactors, petri dishes. I may have the terminology wrong. But those things growing in this nutrient broth are concentrated feeding operations. They're not animals, but you're bringing food. Cargill will supply it very happily. It's an opportunity for them. To me, the problem with the beef industry, the meat industry, is we have removed the animals from the land.
Thanks. So you talk about disruption as being, I think, maybe not a value, but something that you see this as doing. And it makes me think about maybe, I don't know if disruption, the term was in vogue when GMOs were first coming to market, but potentially it has the same kind of profound effect. That's obviously a very dirty word. It's not even a word that I think the government is even using anymore. I think bioengineered is going to be the correct nomenclature. But maybe we could turn it over. Maybe we could turn it over to you, Brian, and we could talk a bit about how the government is going to regulate this kind of technology. I bring up GMOs also because, I understand that was a time, or that was a product that was jointly regulated to a degree by the Food and Drug Administration and the USDA. The question then becomes, how does the regulation create a sense of trust and acceptance with the public in a way that we saw didn't happen with GMOs?
Great question. I think a good place to start would be the letter that the Meat Institute sent with Memphis Meats to the White House back on August 23rd. In that letter, they call for a pathway where FDA would exercise oversight with regard to pre-market safety, and then USDA would take over inspections day-to-day, as well as labeling oversight. And that's based on well-established precedent that the statutory framework has in place. So FDA, just by way of brief background, regulates foods pursuant to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and USDA regulates meat and poultry products. They have their own statutes. Under the statutes that USDA administers, once a product is meat or poultry, then those statutes are triggered, and you have to get inspected. You have to have inspectors from USDA at your plants. Now, FDA has a lot of experience with regard to cell culture technology from their uses in the biomedical field. And so I believe that the letter, and Mark will expand on this, the letter is really leveraging the expertise of both agencies and bringing them together. With regard to biotechnology products, back in 1992, the FDA issued a policy document which was meant to clarify the agency's approach to regulating products of biotechnology, so if you're using CRISPR and so forth. The agency really did not see the need for adding new rules and requirements because based on their safety evaluation, they found that the products of biotechnology from a standpoint of from an objective standpoint, were the same. There was no safety difference between the products. Objectively, the characteristics of both products from an organoleptic standpoint, et cetera, they were the same.
Sorry, what is that word you just used?
Just like in terms of taste, texture, organoleptic, yeah.
Organoleptic.
Yeah.
All right.
And I think the same basic principles apply when we're talking about cell-based meat. From my understanding, cell-based meat is not like plant-based meat, which is mimicking meat, but this is actually meat. It meets the definition of meat and poultry under USDA statutes, and so USDA appears to be the best place to have labeling oversight, for example. I know we're probably going to touch on labeling in more depth in a bit. So I think that pretty much, does that answer your question?
It does.
Okay.
It does. Mark, you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, just that I'm going to go back to the letter that Brian referenced. It's true, we sent a letter with Memphis Meats to the president in August. If you say it's the 23rd, I forget. But for anybody in the audience who's read that and has any misconceptions, let me be clear. What we are calling for in that letter is what I call regular order. In other words, the same processes that FDA and USDA used to develop the appropriate parameters for irradiation. The same parameters for food additives, be they direct or indirect. These are all processes that FDA takes the first crack at it. They set the ground rules, and then if that process or that additive, irradiation, by the way, is an additive by definition, if they set that, then USDA administers those parameters when inspecting meat and poultry products. So like I said, what we're calling for here is regular order. This technology should be treated no differently than a whole host of other technologies that have come across over the past 30, 40, 50 years. And everybody, for 30, 40, 50 years, everybody had a bright new technology, right? This is the most recent one. There will be another one after that.
Thanks. You guys have anything you want to add to that? Or?
Not right now, no.
All right, moving right along. So at least when I think about what regulation is supposed to be doing, well, it's supposed to be doing a lot of things, but at least what I hear from a lot of the companies and maybe even from consumers and boosters is that regulation is standing in the way of us getting this to market. I see you shaking your head. We'll get to you in a second. But I just want to talk briefly. You know, I saw a few of you guys in Washington, D.C. last week. There was a joint meeting between the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Food and Drug Administration. And nothing was set in stone, but what Secretary Sonny Perdue and what FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb were saying is that what they'd like to do is get a regulatory framework in place before they start seeing any applications for a cell-cultured meat product. And the Secretary of Agriculture said, if we can get that done in 2019, that'd be pretty fast. So when I heard that, my first thought was, well, 2019, maybe it sounds fast if you're a consumer and you read about the stuff in the media and you want to get it in the supermarket, but there are some cell-cultured meat companies that want to get their stuff out right now. And by right now, I mean 2018, it's November. Just said they wanted to have a product out by the end of the year. Now, is 2019 going to be fast enough, maybe for you, Brian, and your company? And then also I want to ask, you know, let's say 2019 isn't fast enough for you to bring your product to market here in the States. What would be the problem if you brought it to market in, let's say, Singapore first?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, I was in DC last week. It was good to be home. I told the folks there I'm from that area, so born in born in Maryland, Baltimore, and then grew up in Northwest Maryland. So my father was career FDA, in fact. So retired as a deputy director of the FDA. And so I grew up with these grand tales of how the FDA has kept us safe. He brought up the issue of thalidomide and how we had not made the mistake that Europe made, and we didn't have armless babies. And so I'm steeped in this tradition or the idea that our regulators actually do keep us safe, and I'm thankful for that. So in that respect, we are very willing to work with regulators to receive guidelines and to work to create guidelines in order for us to bring this to market safely. So we, for instance, are working with toxicologists now, so at our company to understand how to make this the safest possible thing that we can create. In fact, that's one of the things that we say about our meat is that it's tastier, healthier, and more sustainable than anything that's out there. So in regards to timeline, you asked about, for instance, Singapore. So we have been approached by Asian nations, right, saying that, hey, we will roll out the red regulatory carpet for you. We will make this really easy. And so your question is, well, why don't we do that? And there are a lot of reasons why or why not. I think the United States has I'll say the Bay Area has a great investor climate. So a lot of our investors are here. A lot of the appetite to try this is here. A lot of the ecosystem is here. A lot of the talent, a lot of the infrastructure. So for us to make a good company, it actually makes a lot of sense to do it here. So if we're going to be serving it in restaurants like we will be, if we create it here and then ship it to Singapore, you'll probably have a less of a high quality experience. So it makes sense for us to be very close to where the end user is. So that means we'd be a Singapore-based company instead of the United States. And one thing I said at the panel was, where do you want this innovation to occur? For instance, I've been approached by some researcher on cardiomyocytes, which would be, or heart muscles. So essentially saying that, do you realize that if you solve your problems, or the challenges you have in technology, that you'll solve so many issues with our technology? And it's going to just unlock this technological revolution. So the question is, where do we want that to occur? It could be here, but it could be Singapore if we have to go there. It could be China if we have to go there. And so if we can do it here, that would also mean that we have high-paying, safe jobs, both in the research side, but also manufacturing jobs in Middle America as well as Coastal America. So it's good across the board if we stay here.
Brian, you want to take a crack at this?
I think that one issue that I would keep in mind is the U.S. is essentially the gold standard when it comes to product safety, food safety, and to the extent that a product gets released and consumers don't feel like there's a properly vetted, well-considered safety paradigm in place, and somebody ends up getting sick, that could stigmatize the industry for quite some time. So I think I'm glad to hear of other reasons for keeping jobs here in America. But I think that just from a public consumer perception standpoint, it's important to try to do it here at home and do it right.
Got it. Yeah. I think you started by saying that there are people who assert that if in particular these products are regulated primary jurisdiction rests with the USDA, that will stifle innovation. I think that is patently untrue. My grandmother used to say, I'm not sure that she invented the phrase, but I've heard it first from her. If you don't have time to do it right the first time, when are you going to have time to do it over, right? So it seems to me, I'm going to go back to what I said before. This needs to be done in regular order, and that means that the FDA is the first entity that takes a look at this technology to ensure that it is safe. So it is FDA that we step through first. Then we get to USDA. Let me also say that I've been doing USDA work for 34 years, and the USDA regulations are pretty well crafted to be able to deal with this. The HACCP regulations, the SSOPs, everything else, they've got a lot of flexibility. And frankly, I know that what Brian does is way more complicated on the science side than, for example, making hot dogs and a lot of other ready-to-eat products. But the system's in place at USDA to deal with this. The complexity of the product doesn't change the fact that the structure of the regulatory scheme will still work and be applicable here.
All right, thanks. And then actually, Joe, I should loop you in. I mean, do you have any thoughts about this? I know I'm just going to take a guess. I know regulation isn't really your forte, but I mean, maybe in your experience with how your product is regulated, I mean, do you feel that it's a fair process, that it helps you bring your stuff to market? You can pass on this too if you don't.
I'll pass.
All right.
I don't always follow the rules myself, so I'm not going to prescribe them for someone else. Yeah.
That's incriminating. All right.
Yeah. All right. Well then, so then I do want to touch on what's, I don't know, calling it a hot button issue is kind of giving it a lot of, more importance than it's probably due. But the big question is, what do we call this? When I write articles, I always say, what the stuff? And my editor always says, no, you can't call it the stuff. We need to figure out what the right name is for it. And I know it seems like cell-cultured meat is now the term that the government is going to go with. But just because a product is officially called cell-cultured meat doesn't mean that you're going to buy something in the supermarket that says cell-cultured meat. So I want to put a question, obviously, to Brian, but also to Joe, because you guys both you both grow and you both raise products that in many ways are, there's stuff that we know. There you go, saying stuff again. This is meat, this is pork, this is beef, but there's something different about it. And you guys take pride in what you do, and you want to communicate what's different about it. So I'd like to hear from both of you, when your product is in supermarket shelves, what should it say? What do you want it to say? What kind of message do you want the consumer to be taking home when they're just browsing the aisles? And I invite Mark and Brian to weigh in if they have any thoughts too.
Sure, I'll start. The anecdote I like to give is my first experience eating our cell-based meat, or cell-cultured meat, and it was right before the tasting we had in mid-September, and we'd actually purchased some pork from the supermarket and ground it up because we're basically comparing it in the texture and such. And so it was a busy kitchen. We had a lot of those, and we also had our own cell-based meat coming from our labs. And so the chef was cooking up and handed me something to sample, and I tried it, and I'm like, okay, that's bacon. So can I try what we made? And he said, that is what you made. And so my response was, oh, well, that's just bacon. It wasn't that it tasted like meat, it was meat. So what we make is meat. And so when we go to the labeling question, it's meat. Specifically, we make pork. So now you have noted that we are taking great pains to go and make pork in a very different way, in a way that is more environmentally sustainable and better for animals and better for humans. And so we definitely want consumers to be able to have that choice. And so we will label that as such. So it can be something like pork from cell culture. So labeling it so that consumers can choose that.
Great.
So what I want my customers to know is that our management of our animals and land in the last 3 years has increased the soil carbon in the top 6 inches of soil by 7%, sorry. In the next 6 inches by 11%. In the next 6 inches, 5%. That's because animals are involved. I keep hearing this idea that there's a plant-based meat or plant-based whatever. You can't have plants without animals. And the animals need to be managed. Over evolutionary time, they were managed by predators. And the relationship between the predators and the ungulates on the grasslands was necessary for the health both of the animals and the land and the microbes. And so there is no such thing as a plant-based anything in nature. Nature farms with animals. It's absurd to say that cell-based meat is environmentally more sustainable than our practices, which grow soil carbon. There are 5 billion hectares. The gentleman from Australia will know what I'm talking about. For all the rest of you, it's about 11 billion acres. An acre is as big as a football field. They are degraded on Earth. And they've been degraded by mostly organic agriculture, both tillage, by which they grow monoculture crops, and by overgrazing. I'm not an apologist for overgrazing. I'm saying that the disruption is up here, how we think about these things. And the disruption is moving from a reductionist science-based view of the world, although reductionist science can be very useful, to a holistic view and practice. And that's what we do with our grass-fed beef, and it's the reason we and many others around the earth, the world, are building soil carbon like no one thought possible. Now those 5 billion hectares are in arid, most of them are in arid and semi-arid parts of the world. You cannot heal that land without animals. End of story. If your children and your grandchildren are going to enjoy the abundance of nature in the way we do, we're going to have to move beyond this idea of plant-based. The opportunity is in managing our animals and the plants for high ecological function. And the opportunity is way beyond what we really understand. And there's guys in hats like this who are learning about this all over the world. You don't have to have, and you guys are, many of you are brilliant people, and I think this is wonderful that you're on board with what you're doing and trying to address these things. But be prudent.
So adding another perspective to the labeling conversation, I think it's important to remember that there are laws on the books. And those laws say that if you're a food, then you must bear a name. And that name should comport with a standard of identity if one exists. And a standard of identity simply tells you what ingredients or components can be in a food. So for milk, the standard of identity says that you have to be the lacteal secretion from a healthy cow. If you don't have a standard of identity, then you have to be a common or usual name. So keeping those elements in mind, you also have to be truthful and not misleading. So I think for the cell-based meat, it remains to be seen what labeling claims and what overall label is actually going to end up being the winner. But it could be that it's called chicken, but it has a qualifier that says made with cell culture technology. But these are issues that are being worked out as we speak. Last week, USDA, FDA, they both converged at USDA headquarters. They had an entire day dedicated to labeling, and we heard various perspectives from the cattlemen who didn't want to have the name beef associated with the product, to other stakeholders in the meat industry that were fine with adding a qualifier, to folks that were still using clean meat as a terminology. So it remains to be seen, but the principles that I just enumerated, I think, should be kept top of mind when thinking through the appropriate labeling claims that will be on this product.
One last thought. First of all, I'm not in private practice anymore. Brian is still in private practice, and I think he bills by the syllable with organoleptic and lacterol and everything, right? Okay. I think we are overthinking this issue of meat. Whether it is meat is jurisdictional. Go to the grocery store. With the exception of a few products, meatballs, maybe meatloaf, companies don't call these products meat. It's a ribeye steak. It's a hot dog, it's whatever. The term meat doesn't mean much in the market. Meat is jurisdictional in terms of which regulatory agency is going to have primary jurisdiction. After that, I agree with Brian. What is likely to happen is these products are going to be called ground whatever, with some sort of qualifier or descriptor that lets people know this product was produced with this unique technology, and frankly, I suspect that the companies out there that are making these products, they want to distinguish it. I mean, that's why you're doing this. You want it to be known that this is made from something different, because otherwise, who's going to know that it has? I don't agree with everything Brian said, but he wants to make that distinction, because otherwise, how's anybody going to know that it's not just produced like a bratwurst, right?
Can I have one comment? Sorry, that was really
Yeah, go
loud.
right ahead.
Just jumped in there.
Let's have a conversation.
Yeah, okay, we can have those. Just to one of the things that Joe brought up on the idea of the grass-fed, the farm, and you brought up a lot of the benefits that you've been able to accrue to your farm around the carbon capture and such, and I think that's laudable. I think that's respectable. It is really helpful to note, though, that farms like Joe are the vast minority of the farms where we get our meat. If you go downstairs in this mall and go to one of the 20 restaurants downstairs, you will not find any of the meat from Joe's farm. You will not find any meat from grass-fed farms. You will not find any meat from free-range farms. You will find meat from CAFOs. You will find meat from industrial animal agriculture. 99.9% of the chicken that we eat comes from industrial animal agriculture. 95% of the pork comes from that. So when we have this discussion, it's really helpful to frame where our meat comes from. While what you're doing is, again, laudable, that's not where the major problem lies. And so when we look at how we're going to make an impact, the impact is to remove the system which makes meat continually cheaper and therefore creates negative externalities that all of us pay for in terms of the environment, in terms of our human health, in terms of animal welfare.
Well, I would recommend doing that. Remove those incentives whereby the industrial meat production system has become problematic. I understand why feedlots were developed. After marketing grass-finished beef and trying to, fit our animals and finish animals, given the vagaries of nature, I understand. And frankly, and I know this is anathema, I'm sure, but depending on scale, feedlots are not inherently bad. You don't need to feed our animals antibiotics. You don't need to feed them plants from soils that are deficient and degrading. You can do things differently, but I think it's going to be a smaller scale. But what Brian says is, I think, right. Change that. But again, 5 billion degraded hectares. Let me give you an example. In San Benito County, where we're from, we've effectively changed 18 inches of soil. That's pretty deep. In 3 years, 5, 7, and 10%, going down. Say we have that 7% number, and it takes 12, 13, 14, and some odd years if we did it at 7% every year. Maybe we can do it faster. I think we can. But maybe we can just say that. In 14 years, we will have added 1 additional % of organic carbon to our soils. 1 gram of soil carbon can hold 8 grams of water. 1% of soil carbon additional in our soils can hold approximately 20 to 25,000 gallons of water per acre. There's 500,000 acres in San Benito County. If we did that across the county by encouraging grass-fed beef producers and taking your dollars and saying, there's no grass-fed beef in here, I'm not buying it until there is, we would be able to fix not only the carbon, but 20,000 gallons per 500,000 acres. That's an enormous amount of water. And that's the way the earth cools itself. You cover the soil. You extend the green growing season. You get more carbon and more water into the soils, and all of a sudden, the climate begins to moderate. That's the only way we're going to do it. And I'm sure your ideas are going to contribute to that because that's the kind of people you're working toward, and I think that's going to be great.
I want to turn this actually to Mark Dopp for a second. This environmental impact question is very important. It's behind what both of you guys are all about, as far as I understand it. But Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, like most people who eat meat don't really care about that. What about people who aren't motivated by environmental sustainability when they're eating meat? What kind of impact, or how do you impact them if you're trying to get them to eat your product?
Well, let me start by saying I'm not sure I understand your question.
Sure. Let's try again. What I'm hearing from these two over here is that they want people to buy their product because they believe their product improves the environment. We're putting carbon back into the soil. We're not degrading the land. Maybe we're even, returning biodiversity, for example. Those are not values that most meat eaters in America have at the forefront of their mind when they decide to eat meat. I mean, am I wrong in saying that?
Well, I'm not sure that it's appropriate for either you or me to decide what the values are of people across the country. I will say this. I admire what Joe does, and I'm more than curious about what Brian's company is doing. Having said that, I think if anybody in this room believes that we're not going to continue to kill livestock to feed the country and the world, they're fooling themselves. very immediate past CEO of Tyson Foods. I mean, Tyson's is an investor in Memphis Meats, as is Cargill. And Tom said, we're going to continue to kill cattle, kill hogs. It's what they do because it's necessary. I think what you're getting at is, this is part of a conversation we had last night. I grew up in a small town in west central Wisconsin, population 2,400 people. You know what matters most to them? Price. Price, flavor, and price are the three driving factors. And if you don't believe that, the people in this room may not think that way, but the vast majority of people who live and die in this country, all across it, that's what they care about first and foremost. If I answered your question?
Yeah, you did. I was driving at that.
If I can jump in again, sorry,
Yeah,
I
go
keep
right ahead.
doing this. Small town-wise, I grew up in the town of Boonesboro, Maryland, 2000, very rural, grew up working on a farm. I certainly know so 5 kids in the family, father was FDA employee, mother didn't work, so I certainly know price, taste, price. When we talk to consumers, we obviously bring up tastier, healthier, more sustainable, in that order, right? So what accrues to the customer? We can make better tasting meat because we're not limited to an animal. When you have an animal, you can engineer an animal to give you a slightly different taste, but there's only so far you can engineer it. So we can actually, we can entirely control the system. We control what the cell gets, the fatty acids, the amino acids, the vitamins, the minerals. We can improve the taste. We can also change the health. Out of the box, if we make our cell-grown or cell culture meat, then you don't get contamination danger, right? So people die every year from Listeria, E. coli, Salmonella. You don't get that. You don't also get the antibiotic resistance in the food that we have, in the food that we create. And you also don't get long-term health effects, or we can improve long-term health effects as well. So if we talk about the fact that 1.2 million Americans die every year from cancer, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, stroke, all of which are linked to a higher incidence of meat consumption. Well, why is that? Well, we can look at what the saturated fat content is of the meat that we create. We can look at the metabolic pathways for the proteins that create the cancer that are the end result of eating too much meat, and we can change that. We can make this healthier.
Yeah, 2 things in response. One, the idea that the products that are going to be produced from this technology are quote-unquote safe, I think is a myth. Just last week, and even in the July 12 meeting that FDA had, there was an extensive amount of discussion about sources of contamination. And if you're talking about RTE and Listeria, if you start talking about taking these cell-based products and converting them into something that is ready to eat, well, you've introduced the concept of being contaminated with Listeria monocytogenes in the environment. Trust me, we know something about that. Second, you made a comment about consumers. Let me just say this. Consumers always answer the question, yes, they want this, they want everything. And I point to, as an example, the failed experiment of mandatory country of origin labeling. Everybody says they want to know where their food comes from, and everybody says that they're willing to pay more for it. Guess what? They're not willing to pay more for it.
All right, well, I want to return to this question about, if not environmentalism, then certainly animal welfare is a big part of what animates this technology, probably in the interest of a lot of people in this room. And, I mean, Mark, you took the words out of my tongue. You said there's just no way where there's going to be a world where we don't slaughter farm animals. And I kind of want to twist this a little bit, and Joe, obviously, you should answer this, but anyone else should feel free to chime in. I mean, first of all, do we want a world where we don't slaughter farm animals? Do we want a world where we take biopsies of farm animals instead? Let's just unpack that for a little bit and try to think about what the implications of this tech really are.
No. I mean, life cycles, yeah. Life cycles, birth, growth, death, decay. That is the way it's going to work, whether we're eating them or a lion eats them or whatever. But I really can't understand. I can't imagine, given California's 35, 40 million people, vast herds of animals roaming around with predators, keeping them bunched and moving, and their urine and manure fertilizing the land as they go, and they're grazing and cycling all this carbonaceous material that is grown through photosynthesis and all this stuff. It's not going to happen. We have to have management, and we have to have the old making room for the young. And I'll be the first to admit, you know, death of ourselves, of our families, of our loved ones, of our animals is, you know, not a savory thing. Although it's a hallmark of a really mature spiritual life that we can approach death with joy. And so I'll just offer that. But, you know, I manage a lot of animals in the winter and spring. The animals migrate basically from the mountains on semi-trucks, so you're all safe coming across 80. But they migrate here, and I manage 2,500 to 3,000 animals on our 12,000 acres of ranches, and there's 4 ranches, so it's extremely complex. It's very busy. I can manage with my 2 little dogs and me and a horse, or not, 1,000 animals in a herd, move them uphill a mile or so and through a 10-foot gate by myself and these 2 dogs. And if I were not approaching those animals as they understand and are comfortable with, they wouldn't do that. So the idea that ranchers, cowboys are, you know, brutal because we eat meat or whatever the mythology is, I'm not that way. We couldn't do what we do. And I guarantee if PETA and the Humane Society people were managing the ranches, they would have a steep learning curve to be able to take care of the things we do. Many people have mentioned my hat today. They really like it, you know. And I mentioned earlier that my family's been in ranching for 5 generations. One of the things I want to engender in my customers when they eat our beef and they meet us is affection. Not only for me, but for the land and for the animals and the blessing which this work provides to them. And that's why you guys like this hat, because it comes from a culture that's deep, and it's been working itself out and continues to over many generations. And I'm skeptical that the arrangement that you're talking about with cell-based meat is going to engender this sort of affection for the things we need affection for. The connection to the land and the animals and our neighbors. I don't know if I'm right, but that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, the University of Oklahoma did a poll earlier this year where they surveyed Americans. They found that 90% of Americans want to eat meat, and 47% of Americans want to ban slaughterhouses. Americans want meat, they don't want slaughter. We can provide them meat without slaughter. So if we can do that, why are we slaughtering? And I agree that Joe's hat is great. It's fantastic. I wish I had brought a hat like that.
Stetson?
I don't know. Debar him. And Joe has a certain, as he said, there is a certain image of a cowboy or somebody that works on a ranch, that we have that image of where our food comes from, because we like that image of where our food comes from. We like the idea of a natural environment. We like to envision a farm, a barn, beautiful bucolic setting. That's not where our food comes from. That's not where our meat comes from. Industrial animal agriculture is typically composed of sheds with animals in them that don't see the light of day. That's where the 99% of where our meat comes from. So don't be fooled.
Change that.
I am.
All right, well, that's the last word. Thanks so much.